There we go. Welcome, I'm Walcom, and this is the Colonel Wasp 77, the upgrade of the original Colonel Wasp 76. It is an AEG-style short dart blaster that is fed by Talon mags, powered by a 3S LiPo battery with an XT30-style connector that runs a gearbox that primes back a spring-loaded plunger and flings a foam dart. It's a bit of a unique design, so let's go over what makes this thing actually special. Up at the front, you've got a 16mm outer diameter barrel. Your mileage may vary because it's a little bit more like 16.1, but if you sand it down, just about any kind of SCAR or B-car muzzle should fit on the end of this thing to increase your accuracy. Below that, we've got a short Picatinny rail that is really useful for any kind of foregrip you have. Up at the top, we've got a very long Picatinny rail that is perfect for any kind of optics you may want to use. As you can see, since I have the clear version, although there are different color schemes, some transparent, some not, the gearbox is located right up here, which works as a pretty good foregrip. You've got a reciprocating kind of priming bolt right there with a spring load. It is incredibly heavy, but it does allow you to manually cycle the blaster because even though it does use a battery, you can run this blaster without one. Behind that, we've got your magazine. Well, this of course takes standard Talon mags, or in this case, a curved Talon mag, but all your Dart Zone and X-Shot mags should work perfectly fine, and of course your worker ones. Behind that, on the right-hand side, we've got the button of ultimate importance. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but unfortunately, it's also one of the biggest problems with this blaster. And on the left side, we've got a fire selector switch. Yep, this thing is select fire. A monstrously huge trigger that is a straight pullback design. An AR or AEG style grip right here. It does work with a variety of AEG grips. It is a standard bolt pattern. That is also where your battery will go, so you need to find a battery that will fit inside of this one. I'll have one linked down in the description below. There is a small little plate that screws in here to work as a battery door. I already lost it, and trust me, you're not going to want to use it. And then on the very back, we've got what looks to be some kind of buffer tube with a little tiny stock pad on it. This is the same diameter as a buffer tube, but it is not a buffer tube. It does thread on, but no buffer tube I have actually threads in there, unfortunately. So it may be wholly unique to this blaster. There are 3D printed parts that can turn this into a kind of buffer tube, but straight from the factory, it does not. And if you unthread the not buffer tube, that is where your spring is located, which means swapping out springs on the Colonel Wasp 77 takes literal seconds. The little plastic piece on the end here does work as a kind of point of contact for a stock, but it is definitely not one. The length of pull is not quite there. But overall, the blaster's length is very short, although it is a little bit thick because of the charging handles there. There is no computer brain inside of the Colonel Wasp 77, much like the 76. It is entirely analog, and it knows how to cycle and run the gearbox and everything through micro switches. Before plugging in a LiPo, make sure the button is fully pressed out. We can fish out our XT30 connector here and plug in our battery, and then just kind of stuff it in the grip. If you do it right, it will not fall out. We can load in our magazine, and just behind the magazine well is an ambidextrous kind of magazine release lever, and it does freely drop mags. And when we press this button, the system arms itself. Now the blaster is fully loaded and ready to go. There are 3 positions to your select fire switch. We've got safe, we've got 1, which is semi-auto, and then we have A, which is automatic. Look the 77 into single shot, and it fires a dart. If I squeeze and hold the trigger, nothing happens, but it does cycle every single time you hear that trigger catch break. Flip it up into automatic, and when it breaks, if you hold down the trigger, yeah, it does that. And if we want to, we can even power off the blaster here, pull the trigger, and it will not cycle again. It is now completely safe. But if we want to, we can prime this blaster back manually, pull the trigger, and it will fire. These metal pieces right up here are just reinforcement. They kind of clamp onto the clear shell. They clamp on this metal plate and they're secured by screws. And that's the entire manual of arms for the Colonel Wasp 77. I did purchase the 77 off a friend who bought it and had instant regrets, but I'll have a link down below from where they purchased it. There were 2 different springs included, with the less powerful spring hitting around 230 feet per second velocity-wise, which is insanely high for a short dart blaster, at least in semi-automatic. The larger of the 2 springs hit far harder, kissing almost 300 feet per second, which is up there with some of the strongest blasters you could buy and build, let alone from something this size at a select fire. I use my HQ metal B card that I got from Phantom Toys, and the accuracy with the 77 is phenomenal. With the right setup, this blaster will absolutely deliver. The barrel is not quick change, unfortunately, and is unique to this blaster itself, but the 77 is capable of delivering high power with high accuracy, and again, in a very compact package. However, the full auto mode doesn't work exactly how it's supposed to. My initial readings with this one were incredibly inconsistent, and Colonel Wasp themselves actually showed that there's a bar that you can shave about 1 millimeter of material off, which will increase your consistency in full auto, and I would assume maybe further batches will have that fixed out of the box. And the shell body of the blaster is very thick. It's definitely better than the thinner, more crackable plastic that the 76 was made out of. And I've actually had this blaster for a couple of months. I ran dozens of magazines through it, and I haven't had a single issue with the body breaking. But now we can get into some opinions, because there are a fair bit of negatives. In fact, Monkey Mods themselves didn't like this blaster at all, with the main problem being the trigger pull. Since this blaster is analog, there's no computer brain, there's no circuitry or anything in the trigger system. Again, you can run it without a battery. The trigger is exceptionally wide, it's like almost an inch thick, and with the heavier springs, you do wind up having to have a lot of force to pull the trigger. And if you aren't pulling it with the pad of your finger and you're using kind of the elbow of your finger, that can lead to you pinching your finger in between the shell and the trigger, which is very not cool. And while the shell body seems very durable, the screws that hold in these metal plates right here, which hold on this front reinforcement plate, on mine are completely stripped. In fact, while I was shooting the initial test footage of this blaster, one of the screws just fell out. I've secured them with super glue, and it's not really an issue unless you're gonna take apart your blaster, but it is something to make note of. The fact that this stock is the exact same diameter as a buffer tube, but isn't a buffer tube, and even though it screws in, it isn't a standard screw thread, is incredibly annoying. And as far as I know, even months after this blaster's release, there are no freely available 3D printer files to kind of fix this stuff. And quite honestly, I don't like putting 3D printed stuff on my injection molded blasters if I can avoid it. And of course, the issue with the full auto being incredibly inconsistent, requiring you to disassemble the blaster, take out a part, and file off material 1 millimeter, even though I did 1 millimeter and it didn't quite look right and it didn't function any better, is very sketchy to say the least. I do not recommend this blaster for a new person. It is very good, but it's a blaster for the right kind of person, and that's where all the positives come in, because the ability to swap out springs on this thing effortlessly is the biggest boon. If you've ever used an AEG style blaster before, changing out the springs is incredibly difficult in those, if not almost impossible. The 77 does it in seconds, and that does allow you to tinker with different spring loads and different weights and everything like that, dial in the performance where you want it. But the fact that a blaster this long can hit almost 300 feet per second velocity is almost unheard of. I don't know how much extra power you can squeeze out of the 77, but what we have here is good for even some very low velocity, but also consistent for much higher. I did play around and I got a low powered spring that sometimes hit around 130 feet per second, but also sometimes didn't have enough air pressure to push the dart out of the barrel. So if you like to tinker and you like to mess with these kinds of things, the 77 is the blaster for you, and I feel like this blaster will have a lot of fans because of that. It's a shame it doesn't use standard barrels that threaten or anything like that, but you can get a lot with what's already included. And these types of blasters do need some maintenance. I mean, there's gunk buildup, the gears need to have lubricant on them so they don't destroy themselves, and Colonel Wasp thought through because there are various ports on the blaster that allow you to just pour lubricant in there and make sure everything is happy. It does seem to use standard Airsoft AEG motors, so there may be some performance enhancements you can get, and the gears, from what I can see, are identical to what's with the 76. The 77 does a lot of things right, but it does plenty enough wrong that it makes it a difficult recommendation. AEGs are some of the best blasters you can get your hands on, and I wish the 77 was an easier recommendation for newcomers. Starting at around $200, I believe it was $230 for this specific one, that is incredibly good. One thing to note of though is that you can keep this thing in full auto, and since you have to do the manual trigger break every single time you use it anyway, it's very, very easy to fire off single shots in full auto and then hold it down when you need to dump. And despite all of the issues and some negativity around this blaster, I do really like it. The power, the customization, the accuracy in this form factor cannot be understated. And if you're looking into getting a good AEG and you're willing to learn how to tinker with them, the 77 may be the blaster for you. But it feels like a tool room prototype. It feels like it wasn't quite there. And the biggest issue, the glaring red flag about this blaster is this button right here. because it is essentially an on-off switch for the entire system. If the blaster is not primed with a battery in it, and you so much as touch that button, and that is such a massive design flaw. This button is so easy to accidentally hit, and this is a lot of power and a lot of problem in one spot. I know Tag accidentally set his down on the end of a table. The priming rod actually caught the edge of the table and flung his 77 across the room, and did actually manage to break the breech block, although he glued it back together and he said it worked fine. But you can imagine if you get something caught in here, if your finger's in the way, there are so many injury potential points on this that it's gonna be a huge, huge problem. A very simple switch design, I would recommend replacing that with maybe like a toggle switch or something like that. Maybe even putting something over it to block the button from being accessible so it doesn't accidentally get activated. That issue further harms my recommendation for the 77. But again, the right kind of person who knows what they're doing and is willing to tinker will absolutely love this thing. And from where I'm standing, I'm actually a big fan. It isn't perfect, and few things are, but it is definitely a giant leap forward for the AEG or AEB style platform. And in the right hands, it's gonna be practically unbeatable.